So, when we left off, Japan was being strangled to death, economically speaking, by the United States under the duress of a boycott, a embargo of scrap iron, steel, oil, etc., etc. And Japanese leaders knew that they had a choice: either back down or move forward. And we know what they chose now, because this gets us to the planning for and then the attack on Pearl Harbor. So Japan actually chose to strike out at the U.S. And begin a war rather than negotiate, knowing that if it negotiated, it would have to give up some of its imperial holdings, give up some of its control in Asia, where its empire was. But to American eyes and ears, this looks crazy today. How could Japan have thought, as much of a success story as it was, and it certainly was that, this rise to power, becoming an industrial country, in a couple of decades basically, and a major power in that same time frame. Nonetheless, the United States is a much bigger and much more powerful country in every way. So, what were Japan's leaders thinking? Well, there are a couple of things here. One of them is irrational, and one of them I think is rational, even though it didn't work out that way. And some Japanese military and political leaders didn't think it would work out that way. But the idea was still, I think, in the realm of the rational. And Admiral Yamamoto, the guy who was tasked with developing and carrying out a plan to attack Pearl Harbor, we'll get into it in a minute, but he also believed that this was the only possible way, his approach, that a war with the United States could prove successful. So the irrational part of this is, it was bizarre, but the Japanese army during this period, somewhat still enamored with samurai values from days gone by, from previous centuries, but also with a new value system that is kind of quasi-fascist in a sense, both of which were very warlike and very aggressive. Both value systems, the old and the new. I always argue that if it's the combination of kind of an old aggressive, ultra aggressive mindset and worldview, attached to a new one, that made it so potent. And in the Japanese army, there was such a fervent belief, and it really was belief. This is almost religious belief based on faith, that Japan could not lose, that it was destined that they were going to be victorious. Why? It was just destined they were going to be. This is the rational part. Now, there's also something else that should be said. The Japanese Navy, and Yamamoto was one of the highest-ranking naval officials, admirals. This irrational attitude wasn't prevalent in the Navy, only in the Army. So this is an interesting split. It's been explained by historians before as having to do with the fact that most of the time, there are exceptions of course, naval officers, because of the branch of the service they're in and what they do, have traveled the world a bit more, and they tend to be more realistic. The Army soldiers and officers tended to be, those that had stayed closer to home, maybe never left home, and weren't as privy to, what awaited them out there in the rest of the world. At any rate, whatever the explanation, it was primarily in the Army, and the Army alone, that this mentality prevailed. But as the war goes on, the political decisions were more and more made by the military, or politicians basically subservient to the military, and the irrational idea that we can't lose stuck in the minds of the Army and its supporters through basically the whole war. The rational explanation for Pearl Harbor is that the Japanese understood, Yamamoto is in this camp, that they could not win a long, drawn-out, full-on war with the United States. So what they might be able to achieve is a sort of quick punch in the nose, not just at Pearl Harbor, but Pearl Harbor and some other lightning strikes in other parts of the world, which is exactly what they did, and then hope the United States is so stunned and so opposed to a long drawn-out war that they sit down and negotiate and try to negotiate, which Japan hadn't done already. They went to war instead. But if they punch the U.S. in the nose and are successful at Pearl Harbor or other places, they'll be able to sit down at the table with a stronger hand to play and not have to give up as much territory, as many of their gains as they would have otherwise. So that a short war for tactical success in negotiating and what you get on the other side of that through the process of peacemaking and peace treaty in terms, that looked doable, and I think it was rational. It didn't work out that way because the U.S. wanted no part of a limited war. Once it was attacked, the United States, was bound and determined to see Japan be completely defeated. And one major Japanese leader, actually at the time that Pearl Harbor was being discussed and planned, said exactly that. You can't fight a short war against them, because if we bomb them, especially in a surprise attack, they're not going to forget it. They're not just going to come to the negotiating table after that. They're going to go into an all-out war, wartime mode, which of course is what happened. But again, something can be rational and still end up not succeeding. I would argue that it was perfectly rational. It was possible, but it didn't work out that way in the end. So Yamamoto was the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, and he was actually against the war, as the quote on the left says, but he thought if the country's going to go to war, that his plan for a quick surprise strike at Pearl Harbor was the only way that they were going to be able to achieve success with that quick knockout blow. So in a heated meeting or series of meetings, he finally convinced the higher-ups and the politicians that if they're going to go to war, this is the only way to do it right here. So it was given the go-ahead. This was very meticulously planned. It wasn't perfectly planned, but close enough that the results are now legendary. Yamamoto's famous, of course, for the statement on the right. Now, after the Pearl Harbor attacks had already happened, after they were successful from the Japanese side, the American Pacific Fleet lay crippled, much of it in Pearl Harbor. He said, "I'm afraid all we've done is awakened a sleeping giant." And I put a question mark on that, because I'm saying, was he right? Is that all they done? And what did he mean by that? Well, the metaphor really speaks for itself, I guess. But if you go in and kick a sleeping giant in the head, it's just going to kind of go ouch and probably be angry, but it's still half asleep, and it's big and lumbering, so it takes a while for it to get on its feet. So you have a chance to sort of take off and run after you've kicked it, and so you have time. But time isn't on your side in the end, because once the monster, the giant, fully wakes up and starts going at a brisk pace and starts overtaking you and catches up to you, then you're going to be in trouble. So this is the meaning behind the sleeping giant, famous reference question by Admiral Yamamoto. They had scouted and gotten the parameters of Pearl Harbor in every way, the depth of the harbor, which was a problem in a number of ways, but they carried out the attack anyway. So another element of the plan was maintaining radio silence all the way across the Pacific Ocean with a whole fleet of ships, and not easy to do, because it's possible the ships can get lost in the middle of the night or in bad weather if they're not in communication with each other, especially if there's little visibility. But it was seen as of the essence to maintain radio silence, because if the Americans were able to hear messages, it could tip them off that the attack was on its way, or that an attack might be on its way. And amazingly, they did maintain radio silence, either completely or, if I could be wrong about that, but not in a way that the United States ever picked up on. So they maintained it close enough to perfect, or perfect, so that the Americans had no idea what was coming next. And what came next was an attack from the sea by airplanes on December 7th, 1941. The Japanese fleet had gone all the way across the Pacific, kind of taken the northern route, and its aircraft carriers and supporting fleet were north of Oahu that morning, as planned, and sent a number of waves of fighter bombers over Pearl Harbor early in the morning, and caught the United States completely off guard. 4 American battleships sunk, 3 damaged, and on down the list. Over 2,400 Americans killed, 1,000 or more wounded, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed, most of them on the ground. Most of them didn't even get off the ground. American officers, leaders had made lots of mistakes ahead of time. There was fear that there were going to be that American planes would be destroyed by saboteurs who would sneak onto airfields in the middle of the night and throw grenades or blow them up. And so the solution to make this easier to defend the planes on the ground was to cluster them together, so they could put 1 or 2 guards around planes that were right next to each other, kind of wingtip to wingtip. But of course, when planes are bombing, it's much better for the planes, for the attackers, if you've lined up your aircraft right next to each other on the ground, because 1 or 2 or 5 bombs will take out more planes that way. So just about everything that could have gone wrong for the U.S. did, and you see the numbers in front of you and the results there. You can see some of the pictures on the right. The USS Arizona, a battleship going down. It's still at the bottom of Pearl Harbor today. The Arizona Memorial in the middle of Pearl Harbor. Some of you may have already been there. If you haven't, it's certainly something you should do if you're ever in Hawaii or on Oahu in Hawaii. But it's harrowing. The water is so clear, you can look down. They've constructed this like stand that's just this permanent sort of structure that's in the harbor, and you can get off the boat. You take a tour from the shore to the little platform, and get out on the platform and stand and look over the edge, and you can see the USS Arizona underneath you. And you know already, if you didn't already, the tour guide has already told you by the time you're there, that there are hundreds of U.S. Service people entombed below. Those that didn't get out of the ship before it sunk, and they were buried there, and are still there. It's quite it's hair raising when you see that. At any rate, so these events are now quite famous, and the one major saving grace was the fact that the American aircraft carriers were out at sea unbeknownst to the Japanese. They'd hoped to catch the aircraft carriers in the harbor as well. Had they done so, this would have been a complete rout. But since just by chance the carriers were out on maneuvers, they didn't get hit, and so they were saved. The surprise was so complete that American leaders, American soldiers, were coming out of their rooms, their apartments, their barracks where they were living in the morning. What is that god awful noise? Why are those planes flying so low? The attack came on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. Why Sunday? And some of you probably said this to yourselves already, and students always do, that, well, they were in church. I always like that answer. They were in church. Really? Mostly young adult males in Hawaii, where Waikiki Beach is, probably out on Saturday night, which comes just before Sunday morning, last time I checked. They're in church? No, they're in bed with a hangover. And this appears to have been part of the plan as well. We'll catch them completely off guard by attacking on Sunday morning. Some of it may have been church as well. It's possible, but much more likely that far more of the soldiers and sailors were confused because they were half drunk still. The response by the United States wasn't surprising to anyone in the United States, but it appears to have been surprising to many Japanese leaders. President Roosevelt went before Congress the next day in a joint session of Congress, December 8th, 1941, and said famously, you can see film clips with sound, the original sound in this, YouTube it, it's interesting, but he said yesterday, on December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. The Empire of Japan, bombed us, and basically the United States declared war the next day. Professor Hansen says the once ascendant Axis powers, Japan, Germany, were completely ill-prepared politically, economically, and militarily to win the global war they had blundered into during 1941. Simply killing the far greater number of soldiers and civilians over the next 4 years, the vast majority of them Russians, East Europeans, and Chinese, never equated to destroying their enemy's ability to make war. So I put this quote here to say that Japan, by planning for a short war to get the United States to sort of come to terms quickly, backfired quickly, and they got then stuck in a war that the one they didn't want to get into, which is a long, drawn-out, full-on, head-to-head battle over the long run, and that's exactly what the United States is doing. And so Hansen is saying here that the Germans and the Japanese had no chance once the U.S. gets involved in the war. And once Russia got involved in the war. In the summer of 1941, a number of months before Pearl Harbor, Hitler made the bad decision, to invade the Soviet Union. And so within 6 months of each other, Germany and Japan had attacked the two most powerful countries in the world after already having a lot of success, or at least potential success in Japan's case, as long as they didn't get the United States involved. And furthermore, the quote is saying that the German military especially was so good that it almost always killed more opponents than it allowed to kill them in combat, a unit, and a division, an army, whatever it was. But he's saying here that didn't matter, that the Allies still had the advantage because they had more people, more soldiers, more weapons, bigger economies, and could wear down, and did wear down, the Axis powers. By the way, this quote applies here in a way that might not seem like it does, because what you might not know is that 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany declared war on the U.S., not the other way around. So Roosevelt, now, right after having worked a number of years to, slyly nudge American public opinion, inch by inch closer to accepting war, now has no problem. After Pearl Harbor, people are, jumping all over the place, jumping over each other to try to sign up for the war. Young men, everywhere. So there was no sales job necessary on the part of the president from this point on. The U.S. Had to have a strategy here. Remember, Europe was first, since in one stroke after Pearl Harbor, now the U.S. is at war on two fronts, both with Japan and Germany. But President Roosevelt and General Marshall and the other big brass of the military decided it was Europe first. One person for sure in the military that didn't agree with this, and I'm sure there were others, is the guy on the right, Douglas MacArthur, who had basically made his military career in Asia. He considered himself an expert on Asia, quite arrogantly. But it's these two guys that were given primary command of American forces in the Pacific theater of the war, Admiral Chester Nimitz on the left and MacArthur on the right. MacArthur was in the process here of turning himself into a big-time war hero. arguably the most legendary to come out of this war on the American side, though there are a couple others that may have equaled or surpassed him, depending on how you're looking at it. So the strategy that was devised, partly by these guys, remember they're the on-ground commanders that are there in the Pacific Theater. So partly coming from the government in Washington D.C., the military, the Pentagon, George C. Marshall, etc. The strategy, sometimes referred to as island hopping, was what was put into place, and the idea, simply put, was to get across the Pacific, sort of one island chain at a time, and attack Japanese held islands and defensive installations that had been prepared, for years, while Japan was moving through Asia, moving south from China into Indochina during the 1930s, as we already talked about. It was also, and in some cases already had, occupying and controlling South Pacific islands. And so for the United States to get across the Pacific to within bombing range of Japan, it was going to have to sort of go from island chain to island chain and attack Japanese islands, that were defended, to the teeth, with thousands of Japanese soldiers and high-tech weapons, high-tech for the time, and so it wasn't going to be easy. But American leaders realized that we don't have to attack every Japanese defensive position on every island, because the ones we don't attack, where are they going to go? Let's go around them. But we're going to have to attack at least one or more islands in every island chain, further and further west, in order to be able to land our planes there. And sometimes they had to build an airfield after they took the island by force from Japan. Sometimes they captured an island, after days, weeks, months of combat that already had an airfield the Japanese had built, so that part was already done. Part of the reason they had to do this in kind of this creeping fashion, step by step, is in those days, aircraft, bombers, did not have the ability to go all the way across an ocean. Their range was actually quite limited. The B-52 comes after the war, and so they had to be pretty close to Japan before they could stage bombing raids, on the Japanese mainland, Tokyo, and the other big industrial cities of that country. So island hopping was getting across sort of island chain by island chain, island by island, hopping over some islands, leaving them there, and only taking the ones that you need in order to stage the next move into the next set of islands to the west by building or taking airfields from there. It was also a part of the plan, as was obvious, that while all this was going on, that the Japanese Navy and Air Force would need to be dealt with and, if not destroyed, greatly weakened and diminished by constant American attack on it. The Japanese had revolutionized naval warfare in the attack on Pearl Harbor and would continue to for a while. In the First World War, the navies, at least all the countries in the world that had major navies, the main center of battle was the battleship, and the battleship is a powerful weapon, and it's actually kind of addicting in a sense. If you're a political or military leader, your country's engaged in war, you want a lot of battleships. They have awesome firepower. They're impressive, and sure enough, in World War I, they showed that. But between the two world wars, between the First and Second World War, things changed, and it was the Japanese that figured out first, or at least figured it out and put it into plan first. In every country that had a large navy, including the U.S., there were one or more admirals or military thinkers that were advocating the same thing that the Japanese were. So it wasn't a secret, but Japan was the only country that not only had the thought process in the right place, but had their leaders willing to convert their navy to the new way of doing it. What was recognized and implemented by Japan was that aircraft had improved dramatically since World War I. Aircraft were used in the First World War, but not to any real effect. It didn't affect the outcome of the war. These famous dogfights with the Red Baron, and it was dangerous and dramatic and all that, but it didn't really have an impact on who won the war. Now it was realized that that's not true any longer. In fact, airplanes were feared actually more than the damage they could do, because it was unknown, because it hadn't been done before, how much damage 50 bombers over a city could do to that city. The thinking tended to be everywhere, oh my God, the city will cease to exist, everyone will be killed, or everyone will at least be hit. And of course it is dangerous, and but not, they were not familiar with air war and war, bombs coming from the air, so they tended to overemphasize its impact, both leaders and civilians alike. So the Japanese realized, and again put into play before anybody else, that in the next war, it's not going to be battleships that are the centerpiece of naval warfare. It's going to be the aircraft carrier. Because aircraft now can really go into attack mode, fighters, bombers, fighter bombers, and really make the difference, make a much bigger difference than they ever could before. And so the key to naval power, naval war in the future, isn't the battleship, it's aircraft carriers full of attack planes that can fly off the decks of their carrier one after another and fly either to over islands and bomb them, or fly over the other side, other enemy's fleet, and strafe and or bomb them. So the United States, the other countries that have large navies eventually catch up and start doing this themselves, building more and more aircraft carriers, devising their whole strategy around it. But Japan was in the lead. There were dual lines of American offensive operations in the Pacific, and this is the simplest map I've ever seen showing that. So it doesn't have a couple things I'd like, but if you look at the bottom blue arrow, both arrows kind of going from lower right to upper left, from east to west, or southeast to northwest. The bottom blue line is the area of advance of military forces, land, air, sea forces, naval forces, that were under the command of General MacArthur, already pictured in a previous slide. He was stationed in Australia, an allied country to the United States, so he spent the war basically in Australia, orchestrating what this theater of operations is known as the Southwest Pacific Theater of War. So more or less, not officially, but more or less, he had command of sort of the blue arrow direction. American forces moving in that direction. The arrow above it, to the right of it, was technically, or I should say unofficially, under the control of Admiral Nimitz, also pictured next to MacArthur in that previous slide. And so these are the two major prongs of attack over a number of years. And Americans, as we said, kind of going from island chain and island to island, hopping over some to get within bombing range of Japan. It was a problem, however, I'm going to go back a little bit to that slide, that the president, the chiefs of staff, marshal in Washington, D.C., never made a decision on who was totally in command of American forces in the Pacific. They never designated one or the other of these guys to be the boss, and it caused problems. In military life, in warfare, it's important to have a chain of command and unity of command. When you have multiple leaders and it's unclear who's more powerful than whom, it can cause nightmares and a mess. And this actually did cause a mess. The United States, we know, won the war anyway, but this did cause some problems and made things more difficult than they probably needed to be. Making it all even worse, you can see from their pictures, is something else. And what is it? I'll let you think about it for a second. This still goes on today, of course, but one guy, Nimitz on the left, is a naval officer. The other guy, MacArthur on the right, is an army officer. And there's rivalry between those, inter-service rivalry, as it's called. And to this day, the Army and the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force are always competing for resources, from scarce resources from Congress, and they want to outshine the other one, outdo them, get all the glory, and that ended up being true here as well. And sometimes what happens then, even good men, even good leaders, sort of succumb to this and start putting the interests of their own, personal need for glory and their own, service, Marine Corps, Army, Navy, ahead of what's sort of best for the war effort. So they put their own, what they want to get out of this, becoming a hero, and their branch of the service getting all the glory, ahead of what's actually the best idea or set of ideas, plans for winning the war. And certainly Douglas MacArthur can be rightly accused of this kind of posturing. Part of the reason it appears they didn't give anybody the command was that they were afraid if they gave it to Nimitz that MacArthur would cause all kinds of problems. MacArthur was known already as a loose cannon and would continue to be. He kind of had a crazy genius to him for sure, but he was extremely difficult to deal with. Extremely, very, very full of himself, and so they never did give the command to any one of these two guys or put somebody above them, and it caused some issues. The United States went to work pretty quickly in one of the tasks before it, which was to neutralize or to destroy the Japanese fleet and air force in 1942 in a all-naval battle called Coral Sea in the Pacific. The Japanese won, you could call a tactical victory, but the U.S. won a strategic victory. What that means really is that the Japanese won the day, but they could scarcely afford the losses they took, where the U.S. lost the day, but their losses they could carry and replace much more easily. And then in the same year, a decisive tactical and strategic victory for the U.S. at Midway, sometimes referred to as the Miracle of Midway. On the upper right, you see American planes, and the main miracle story, I'm not saying it was literally a miracle, but that's the name that got attached to this. But a squadron of American planes were lost up in the clouds. I forget why and how it happened. And they sort of dipped below the clouds to try to figure out where they were, and they just happened to be right on top of the Japanese fleet and caught it by surprise. The Japanese didn't know that they were coming because they didn't really know they were coming either. And so some of the victory at Midway was luck. Not all of it, but that part of it certainly was. But on this day, or this number of days, the U.S. lost one carrier, sunk, but it sunk 4 Japanese carriers. And in terms of World War II, warfare at sea, this is a blowout. There are some famous photos in here in the lower left. The USS Yorktown being hit by a Japanese air attack, plane after plane after plane, dropping their bombs and eventually sending the American carrier to the bottom. The first major land battle on an island in the Pacific came at Guadalcanal between August 1942 and February of 43. It took 6 months. Guadalcanal is a pretty big island, at least relative to Pacific islands, and so this is part of the reason it took so long. American losses, mostly Marines, but supplemented by American Army troops as well. 7,000 Americans killed, 29 ships destroyed, 615 aircraft destroyed. So again, this is a land battle, but there's also major activities, combat happening in the air and at sea as well. Japanese losses, though, 30,000 killed, 38 ships lost, and 700 to 900 aircraft destroyed. And this is something we're going to see in slide after slide, measured slightly different ways, because I've taken all these from somewhat different sources, but that the losses are very disproportionate, that Japanese losses are always higher. And there are a number of explanations for it, but the one I want to focus on is the following, and that is that Japanese troops were trained and conditioned and told by their leaders again and again to fight till the end, that it was sort of dishonorable to surrender, that you fought to the death. And so most Japanese troops on these islands, time and time again, did so. There are a few cases where soldiers surrendered on their own, or the commander himself just said, "This is hopeless. We're surrendering." But for the most part, that's not what happened. And this right here was already happening here. Fighting for every last inch of the island, even after they knew they were going to lose. Japanese soldiers would just dig in and make Americans take every last inch of the island, and capture them against their will, or kill or wound them with very few surrendering. And this sort of set the table, was foreshadowing of things to come, because this happened on virtually every island. And I think we should be able to see this is going to be an extremely grueling war. American troops in the Pacific are they have it really tough. An enemy that doesn't surrender is a frightening enemy. It's an enemy that can lower your morale considerably. Think about it for a second. If you know you're winning, and you think, well, wait a minute, by all rights, if the other side was sort of listening to reason, they would have surrendered by now. It's over. They have no chance of winning. And if you know that, you're right. If you're right, and every day after that you go out there and see more and more of your members of a unit and friends getting killed and wounded, the more demoralizing it is. Like, these people shouldn't be getting killed. This should be over. We've already won. And then you start fearing for your own life. And soldiers, if they're willing to take risks of getting killed in the military, that's one thing. But when they think something is sort of hopeless or shouldn't be done, then they really don't want to get shot at. So this is a very difficult enemy to fight, and in very inhospitable conditions. A lot of jungle terrain and coral reef islands that are baking in the sun. Lots of snakes and insects and hot, humid, scorching weather. I think it's fair to say, and a lot has been written about this, that American troops in the Pacific had it rougher than American troops fighting in Europe. Now, there are both tough jobs, and it was extremely dangerous. I don't think I need to tell you that Nazi German forces were extremely difficult to fight. So it was extremely brutal warfare in both places. But I still think that Pacific soldiers, mostly Marines, had a tougher time. Think of it this way: if you were in Europe fighting France, trying to push the Germans out of France, if you fought in the front lines for a while, but then got some leave, you might get leave in London or Paris. Get 5 days in London. That ain't bad. Doesn't make up for the vicious warfare you're involved in much more of the time. But if you're in the Pacific, you just get to go to some dinky island where there's just nothing but mosquitoes and flies, and so the overall experience in the war, I think, was clearly more difficult in multiple ways, some of which I haven't mentioned, for American GIs in the Pacific War against Japan. As part of the recognized need to weaken, destroy the Japanese Air Force as well as the Navy, there were a series of kind of never-ending air raids on a major air station, air facility at a place called Rabaul. And this was off of the coast of New Guinea, and it was in a strategic location. You can't really see it from either of the maps here, but if we go back to this map, sorry, I'm making you dizzy, but Rabaul is more or less kind of between these two arrows, so it's sort of right between them. So it was of strategic importance, of sort of priority number one for Americans to sort of knock out that series of airfields, because hundreds of Japanese planes were being sent into the sky and could go in multiple directions and cause havoc for American operations there. So it was seen as sort of imperative that this be done. By the way, those two arrows, I said, roughly correspond to areas and lines of attack for MacArthur's forces and Nimitz's forces. But since it was all kind of unofficial, there's a lot of kind of overlap and a lot of unclear territory. So who's got jurisdiction over this? And this is another one of the ways that lack of unity of command can be a major problem. It can cause confusion and disorganization, and it did. In the Northern Pacific Theater, Nimitz's territory, the first major landings happened in the Gilbert Islands, at Tarawa, famously, where in a 3-day battle, American Marines had 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded. Japanese losses about 4,500 killed. This was a part of the need to get a foothold in the Marshall Islands so that they could take the next move over to the west, a little bit closer to Japan, and get to the Marianas. So this is the island hopping that we're talking about. But these marine landings, as you can see from the photo on the right, were always extremely costly in American lives. These were really dangerous amphibious operations. These are all islands, so the troops are getting ashore by going from boats, basically what they call landing craft, get off of a larger ship, number of miles out, get in the landing craft, maybe 30, 50 guys fit in the landing craft, depending on the type, and it sort of comes into the shore and basically drops a door down, and everybody runs out or jumps over the sides into the surf and sort of trudges, paddles ashore. Well, they're getting shot at, usually, sometimes taking heavy fire. And the Marine Corps, its original purpose, and it was formed a long time ago, long before this war, was to specialize in these kind of sea-to-shore operations, to handle this kind of thing, amphibious assaults. So in the European theater, because the Marine divisions, all 6 of them, were bogged down in the Pacific, it's the Army that had to figure out and get good at these kind of amphibious landings. But in the Pacific, it was almost all the Marines. After the Gilberts, then the American line of advance moved on the Marianas, landings at Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of 1944. The losses here, I think, are just from Saipan, I believe, but I think that's not enough, sadly, if you include all 3 of them. But once again, you can see from the losses, extremely one-sided, and we already know why. So this becomes increasingly demoralizing, even though the Americans are winning. This one you've probably never heard of, one of the more unsung battles of the Pacific theater of the war, a place called Peleliu, in an island group called the Palaus Islands. And in about a 2 or 3 months battle in 1944, the Americans scrap and fight and scrape to take this little tiny dot of an island, which is mostly a coral reef. So it's hard to see the picture on the left and the picture in kind of the lower middle, but the ground is fairly light. It's because it's mostly coral reef with a bit of sand and dirt over it, and so when it's hot and sunny, as it was in this attack, the sun just sort of glares off of the white rock and the white coral, and the Marines were without water for a lot of, I forget why, but they were parched with thirst, which they would have been anyway in combat. But this is an incredibly hot and uncomfortable situation. That plus the fact that they're under fire from Japanese machine guns, mortars, artillery fire throughout this whole thing. A vicious battle. Many Americans that lived through it believed that it was the most difficult battle of the war. Although there's some competition for that status. One of the most difficult or some of the most bitter fighting happened in a place called Bloody Nose Ridge. 1,800 Americans killed, 8,000 wounded, about 11,000 Japanese soldiers killed. But this, if you can see in the map in the middle of the screen, the lower left of the map, there's a little X cross, and that was an already built airfield. So this one came equipped with an airfield. They didn't have to build it, which was obviously part of the reason anyway that the attack was undertaken in the first place. However, there's question even to this day, historians still talk about it, write about it, that this operation may not have been necessary, and that Nimitz, this is his territory again, could have called it off, and there were some a call apparently to call it off, but he didn't and went through with it. The point being that there were other islands nearby around about the same distance where they needed to go next that they'd already taken, and so by the time that this operation was ready to go, like, we don't need this island any longer. If that's true, and it's arguable, then the deaths and wounds incurred here may have been totally unnecessary. So was it even necessary? I don't know, and I've read about this on both sides, so the question is still kind of out there. Possibly the most famous and maybe the most vicious battle of the Pacific War was Iwo Jima, the Bonin Islands. And you can see from the fairly simple map there that Iwo Jima is getting indeed close to Japan. So this is now within bombing range of Japan. Iwo Jima was part of a 1-2 punch operation, the latter part coming in Okinawa, which we'll get to momentarily. And this was a small island itself, most of it, lots of white, soft sand, and getting ashore was difficult. The sand was so coarse, or so fine, I should say, that it was hard to even walk in it. And when you're getting shot at, that's a problem. So this battle took also a couple of months, with 6,800 American Marines killed and 22,000 wounded, and about 22,000 Japanese soldiers killed. This qualifies even today as the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. And if you've ever been in the Marine Corps, some of you have, or ever go into it, you'll eventually know that Iwo Jima sort of stands tall in the lore and the traditions of the Marine Corps, and still talked about and very well known by Marines to this day, because this was the bloodiest battle they ever fought in, and they did win it in the end, though not easily. The defenses put up by the Japanese here were unbelievably difficult to overcome. The general in charge, it was Kurabayashi, made sure that he sort of erected all kinds of bunkers and pillboxes and defensive breastworks and positions, barriers all over the island, so that the Japanese would be well dug in, well fortified, and they were. And they were also well armed. They usually were anyway, but on this island they seemed to have had extra cannons, artillery, mortars, and so American troops really went into a hornet's nest when they went here. Making it even more difficult was the fact that the Navy had apparently promised them shelling, artillery bombardment from the sea to loosen up Japanese defenses on Iwo Jima for several days, 10, somewhere in there, days, and in the end they only got 2. And one of the Marine generals went ballistic when he found out, and tried to change the plans, but they wouldn't. Those naval forces, those ships, were scheduled to be somewhere else after 2 days, and so they only provided 2 days of bombardment of the beaches and the Japanese defensive positions along the coast, and left. And the Marine general in question, his name was Smith, said, that's not enough. Our guys are going to be cut down, because we need to weaken the defenses before we go ashore, and they didn't get as much of it as they wanted. So some of the mass casualties you can kind of see in a number of the pictures here on the beach may have been because of the lack of artillery bombardment. Also, this operation, 2-pronged one, Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, had to be sold in Washington, D.C. So a number of the admirals, Spruance and others, he's pretty famous admiral in this war, went to Washington, D.C. by plane to meet with the high brass, George Marshall and the others on the basically what's now the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They weren't called that quite then, but not officially. And they got approved for the operation. And between the time they left, when they left, they'd already scouted the island by air and sort of gotten photos and a pictures both literally and figuratively of what awaited them defensively as far as Japanese firepower on the island before they left for Washington D.C. When they came back with the go-ahead and this took quite some time, they didn't do another reconnaissance of the island again. And what they didn't know is in the meantime, Kurabayashi had kind of like doubled his defensive breastworks and dug himself even further, got more weapons into position. And so the island they were attacking that they knew was heavily defended anyway, by the time they got there, was even way more heavily defended than they knew. So for the Americans to prevail here was remarkable, and the Marine Corps, this could be considered their finest hour, but their most costly as well. Something happened on Iwo Jima that's achieved iconic status, and that was a picture was taken. On the right, you see a none too good duplicate, not too clear, of a famous picture. So famous that the guy in the middle, photographer, AP photographer, won a Pulitzer Prize just for this one picture. And this was the Marines, 5 or 6 of them here, I forget how many there, putting a flag on top of Mount Suribachi. Mount Suribachi you can see a modern picture of in the upper left there, which is on one end of the island of Iwo Jima. And so it's interesting because the Marines had more or less taken the mountain, the hill, and they put a flag up earlier in the morning, but it wasn't an official full-sized flag. And one of the officers below said, no, we can do better than that. Let's get a real flag, a bigger one, take that one down. So another group of Marines went up with another flag, and at the very moment this picture was taken, this famous one, just sort of out of sight, was another group of Marines taking down the other flag, which of course wouldn't have made this picture would not have won the guy in the middle a Pulitzer Prize had there been other guys taking a flag down in the frame. So he got kind of lucky. In fact, some of the other photographers that were there, he wasn't the only one there, actually were in a different angle, and so they didn't take a picture that won them fame and fortune and accolades as Rosenthal did. He became a legendary figure from one picture. I'm not saying he didn't deserve it, but there was some luck involved in this. Apparently all the press guys were kind of waiting and kind of talking together, whatever, and then one of them says, hey, they're about to put the flag, and everybody kind of runs to their camera, and this guy Rosenthal, like everyone else, starts clicking the camera, not really knowing what he's had. He took several pictures, but this is the one that went viral, as they say now. There was no social media, but for as much as something could go viral, this certainly did. It's everywhere even now. There's a monument you see in the bottom left in Washington, D.C. It's been on stamps. It's been on advertisements, keychains. It's kind of a ubiquitous icon and symbol now of American courage and victory in World War II. So Rosenthal actually, remember, there was no digital cameras in those days. You had to get the film developed in darkroom, and there were no darkrooms here. I mean, maybe the Japanese had one, but the island was in their hands. So he sent the film off to another island, a safe island that had already been taken by the Americans, like a base camp now. And he received a message, I forget how many days later, saying, get back to the island, now, from his boss. And he probably thought he might be in trouble or something. And he got back, and the guy called him in just trying to look at this. And he must have known as soon as he saw the photo that this is going to be gold. Why? Well, I won't go into it, but it's kind of a perfect photo. It looks glorious, glamorous. It looks like victory is at hand with a team effort going on. All these guys are sort of pitching in, working together to put the American flag up on top of Mount Suribachi. Sort of a great moment of victory. It couldn't have been captured any more perfectly. Even just the angles, the angle of the flag, All of it was tailor-made for this picture to go viral. It was a little bit misleading, however. And I remember this when I was a kid when I first saw this picture, and then learned about where it was and learned about the battle there. It makes it look like, because this picture evokes victory so much, it makes it look like what's happening is that the Americans have just finished taking the whole island, the last part taken, the top of Mount Suribachi, and now they're planting their final victory flag. Actually, nothing like that is true. They landed on the beaches just on the other side of this mountain. So they had to take the whole other side of the island, which is basically flat. But so they landed here. It was the second day of the battle, out of a 2-month battle, or a month long or more. But how long was the battle? I forget now. 2-month long battle. That they took this island on the second day, and they had weeks to go. So yes, they'd taken this mountain. It's worthy of putting a flag up, and the Marines below cheered, and it probably raised morale to some degree. But it's not quite what it looks. Looks like this is victory. This is the final victory. We've now taken the island of Iwo Jima, which they eventually did take, of course, through great bravery and through a hard-fought victory with an opponent who we know doesn't give up. By the way, Kurobayashi, the general, just to show you how difficult an enemy this was, he actually apparently told his soldiers before the attack happened, this is late in the war. This is already in 1945. The war in Europe ends the next month, in early May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ends in August. So this is getting close to the end. The Japanese surely already knew they were basically defeated here. So General Kurobayashi got his soldiers around him and told them, we're all going to die here. The Americans are definitely going to attack us, and we're not going to surrender. We're going to fight for every last piece of this island. I'm going to die, you're going to die, we're all going to die here. And our goal, because we're going to lose, they're going to take the island, they're going to outnumber us, they're going to outgun us. The Japanese Navy and Air Force had been, for the most part, gravely weakened by this time. So he knew what was in store, and he said, our job then is to kill as many Americans as possible and make this take as long as possible for them. So he's saying we're going to lose, and we're all going to die, but we're going to do it anyway. We're going to inflict as much pain in the process as possible and make it take as long as possible to slow them down from sort of doing anything else or going anywhere else. So this is what Marines were facing that they didn't know. Some things they did know when they landed in 1945 at Iwo Jima. I'm skipping some major battles of the war, but we can't do everything here. The last major battle in MacArthur's area of operations happened in the Philippines on the largest island there of Luzon between January and August of 1945. So several months of battle here. The Americans landed at not on all of the major Philippine islands, but on some of them. Some of them they didn't land on. But Luzon's big islands, where Manila is today, and you can just see from the losses, this was a massive battle. 205,000 Japanese soldiers killed in those number of months. So an extremely one-sided battle. 8,300 Americans killed. But this, in a way, kind of sealed the deal in the Southwest Pacific theater of operations. And in its own way, this is getting close, not so much to Japan, but it's getting close to Japanese holdings, other holdings in Asia. I should have told you, perhaps you already are aware, but General MacArthur had been stationed in the Philippines for years. And so when the attack at Pearl Harbor came, he was the American commander on the ground, senior commander in the Philippines, which was an American colony. He was told by message, by radio, that Pearl Harbor had been bombed and you need to look out because you're going to for sure get attacked like the next day. And somehow MacArthur managed to let himself get attacked with most of his airplanes on the ground the next day. Inexplicable to many others in the military when they heard about this back in Washington, D.C. Like, how could he have possibly done that? We gave him warning. It was for sure he must understand the gravity of the situation, and he let himself get caught with planes, most of them on the ground. The Americans did put up a very lengthy defense in 1941, around the same time as Pearl Harbor, along with Filipino soldiers who fought side of them bravely as well. But the Americans were outmatched, outnumbered by the Japanese soldiers here, and MacArthur left before it was all over. The last American and Filipino holdout area was a island called Corregidor outside of Manila, which eventually fell, and a lot of famous things happened here. One of which was the Bataan Death March. Thousands of American and Filipino troops, after being captured, were marched across a large strip of land for dozens and dozens of miles in the grueling hot sun and under enormously difficult conditions anyway, but being battered and butted with the butts of guns, and sometimes killed by Japanese soldiers, sometimes keeling over and dying from the conditions. This today would surely be considered a war crime or a crime against humanity, the Bataan Death March. But MacArthur left before it was all over, and so got out of there, and he vowed to return. I shall return were his famous words. And so he set himself up to indeed return. And so that's what he did. After Japanese forces were pushed off one of the islands in the Philippines, MacArthur, there's a famous piece of film footage where he's coming out of a landing craft. You see a landing craft in the picture in the bottom of the screen there. But he's the only one that comes out of it, and he comes splashing out into the water about knee deep, and comes ashore in this characteristic regalia and garb that he always wear. And it looks like the press had sort of gotten wind that MacArthur was coming back, finally, after vowing to return, 4 years before. But in truth, and this is the way MacArthur always did things, he set up kind of a photo op for himself. So he planned for the cameras to be set here, and so this is all staged. I mean, he was returning. He was the victorious general, taking the Philippines back from the Japanese. So that's true. But he never missed a photo op. He never missed an opportunity to advertise himself. So, but these are famous, events from the war. Okinawa was the second sort of part of the 1-2 punch that the military leaders, naval leaders in this part of the Pacific had to go to Washington, D.C. to sell. So Iwo Jima first, Okinawa second. But to show you how bad the fighting was on Okinawa, on Iwo Jima, at Okinawa, the original plan was for all 6 Marine divisions to go ashore and fight in this battle. And 3 of them had been beaten up so badly at Iwo Jima, they were out of commission. So only 3 of the 6 Marine divisions, as originally scheduled, landed at Iwo Jima. It tells you something about, again, the difficulty of fighting this war against an extremely determined and able enemy. This is an 82-day battle, 100,000 Japanese casualties. Casualties means killed and wounded are mixed together. In the statistic, and 50,000 American casualties. So about 2 to 1. Tens of thousands of locals were killed as well, who got caught in the crossfire. The Japanese military appears to have used some of the locals as kind of human shields. So the indigenous people suffered very grievously in the middle of caught in the crossfire of this vicious battle, sometimes referred to as the Typhoon of Steel. It was raining for kind of days and days at a time in this tropical island setting anyway, and there's mud everywhere, and the smell of death is everywhere. There were unburied bodies from both sides all over the place. I don't mean to gross you out, but it's the reality. So we backtrack a little bit here and take us back to 1941, 1942, and the origins of the Manhattan Project. In the upper left, you see some number of the intellectual figures with strong government connections, positions, who were instrumental in starting the Manhattan Project. And this, of course, was the development and creation and testing of the first atomic bomb. And the program eventually saw a number of top secret facilities go into place where uranium was produced, plutonium was produced, and the main headquarters was at a place called Los Alamos in New Mexico. And hundreds of scientists, brilliant physicists and mathematicians and chemists and engineers from all over the country and all over the world, in fact, some of the most gifted, sort of lived in this little kind of makeshift town that they put together in the middle of kind of nowhere in New Mexico. Actually, in many ways, a beautiful part of New Mexico. There's mountains not too far away. And the project was headed by a brilliant but eccentric Berkeley physicist named J. Robert Oppenheimer, a true genius, if there ever was one, on the scientific side. And on the military side, General Leslie Groves, you see on the right, Oppenheimer on the left. And they were an unlikely pair. Not that they were great friends, but they were able to maintain a decent working relationship, even with totally different backgrounds and totally different personalities. Oppenheimer was a politically left-leaning guy. A lot of scientists were in those days. He was this sort of effete, sophisticated intellectual, and Groves, even the picture, look, you can see it. Groves is this sort of rough, gruff, tough, Corps of Engineers general. In fact, Leslie Groves, before this claim to fame, was it's his crew. He's an engineer in the Corps of Engineers. He's basically the guy who was in charge of building the Pentagon. So, and he didn't want to take this job. He thought this was a demotion. He wanted to, have a combat position, but he got sent to New Mexico. But he must have quickly realized that what he was doing was arguably the most important work of the entire war, or at least, near the top of the list. At any rate, Oppenheimer and Groves were the scientific and the military head of the project. On the left, you see a number of the gifted thinkers, scientists, one of them super famous. Oppenheimer, of course, became famous as well. He was already legendary as a Berkeley physicist, but this made him known as the father of the atomic bomb ever after, which he was apprehensive about after being the guy in charge of the project that built the first atomic bombs and designing them. He ended up basically turning against the use of nuclear weapons. At least he was kind of in an awkward position because he had some government posts after the war, and so he couldn't come out too openly against the weapons, but he gradually did more and more and lost his U.S. security clearance because of it. Though most of his people that worked with him during this project, including Leslie Groves, testified on his behalf to his loyalty and his determination to be a patriotic American, which he certainly was during the war. On the right, you see the Trinity test photograph of the first nuclear device detonated in world history on July 22nd, 1945. On the upper right, one of the two bombs they made, Fat Man as they called it, Fat Man and Little Boy were the two bombs, little nicknames they had for them, to make it sound like they're kind of harmless and fun. There's always this kind of way of sort of selling weaponry as giving them these very misleading names. Daisy cutters, another name for sort of vicious type of bomb. So euphemisms always for dangerous weapons of mass destruction. Oppenheimer is one of the most interesting figures in American history to me. I read the quintessential biography on him. I read a number of years ago, and he's just an incredible gifted person. Academically, he could do anything in any subject at any time. Uh, as a youngster, his parents knew he was a genius. I don't know from what age, but early on. Uh, and I just love telling this story. I don't know why. But when he was like 7 years old, he's at a family get-together, and he had a female cousin around his age, and he said, let's play a game. I'll ask you a question in Greek, and you respond in Latin. I don't know if his cousin, could do that, or even though he was talking about. Perhaps she did. It was probably a pretty smart family. But this guy was a child prodigy, and went on to become, a major figure in winning the war and in American history. Franklin Roosevelt passed away before the war ended, both in Europe and in Japan, though the war was almost over in Europe when Roosevelt passed away of natural causes. He'd been in failing health for quite some time, although his death was somewhat of a surprise to people close to him and his colleagues and fellow politicians. And his new Vice President, Harry Truman, ends up becoming president, and he was shocked that this happened. I mean, anybody that becomes vice president knows they can become president, of course, but I think he wasn't, mentally prepared at first for the job. And Truman, I think, went on to become a good president in many ways, but he didn't look like the type that would be a good president. He's kind of a rather average-looking, sounding guy. Didn't have a great speaking voice. Wasn't imposing in stature and personality. But he was a hard worker. This guy with lots of grit, determination, and a sharp guy. But the decision about whether to use the atomic bomb or not was left to him, because the Trinity test, wasn't done until July, and he'd been president since April when FDR had passed away. So in all that time, he knew that they were developing the bomb, though he'd never heard of it until he was sworn in as president. In his first briefing by national security, the intelligence community, he was told about this project. And I was like, what? And he was the vice president. He'd never heard of the atomic bomb or the Manhattan Project before. Had no idea. Now he does. It wasn't because, by the way, he wasn't paying attention. It's because that's how top secret it was. They even kept it from the vice president of the United States. So he has to make the decision. And at the top, with a question mark, ask the decision that wasn't. In some ways, this actually wasn't a decision. The point being that the momentum to use the atomic bomb was already there. It probably would have taken a decision to stop the process from going through. And that meeting, asking, I picture guys sitting in the Oval Office, all the big name cabinet secretaries and advisors are there, and Truman starts talking about their options and then goes around the room. Okay, who thinks we should use this bomb? Yes, no, no, yes, no. Goes around the room and then makes a decision whether he listens to the majority or not. But you picture it kind of being done that way, something of that magnitude, and yet that meeting didn't ever happen. Because, again, the bomb was already kind of unofficially on track to be used, and it would have taken an intervention of that type to stop it. And Truman, I'm not sure, he was, aware of this, so I'm not sure how aware he was of, what he might be able to do to derail this, but he apparently didn't want to derail it, because there were plenty of political and military leaders that thought that the bombing was necessary, though there were some that didn't either. So this was open for a debate within the halls of military leaders and political as well. And so the question remains even now: were the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two nuclear bombs dropped on those two cities, was this necessary to win the war? Did it help them win the war? The traditional answer, of course, is yes. And I'll tell you what the conventional wisdom, traditional explanation is. I still think it holds water, but I should tell you that there are a handful of historians that are critics, as there always are, but these guys have put up a pretty good fight. So a handful of books and articles over the years by genuine, legitimate historians have questioned the decision. And some of them, though I don't think any of them say that they know for sure, but think that it's likely that the bombings weren't necessary, that Japan would have surrendered without them. Some of Truman's own advisors did sort of say something to this effect, and the historians in the minority that are critical, saying the bombings weren't necessary, have picked up on that. Some of his advisors told Truman, look, the Japanese are ready to surrender. Everyone knows it. That they're sending out peace feelers all over the world, to Switzerland, and ambassadors in various places. Why they didn't approach the United States, is a good question. Probably to save face, spare the humiliation. But if they really want to get the war over with, they probably should have. Nonetheless, it was clear that they were sending out peace feelers all over the place. They knew they were defeated. The United States also knew they were defeated, Japan that is, because much earlier in the war, like they'd done in Europe, the British had done it actually, the Americans had broken the enemy's code. So they were able to listen in on cables back and forth, particularly, not solely, but particularly of relevance here, between the Japanese foreign minister in Tokyo and the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union. And so we know exactly what both of them were thinking and saying to each other. And this also made it clear that the Japanese were looking for a way to get out of the war. And so what some advisors told Truman is that if you just tell them what's true, and this was true, that the Soviet Union has already agreed to send the Red Army east after Hitler was defeated. At the Yalta Conference, it was agreed by Stalin that within 90 days, roughly, of the end of the war in Europe, he would unleash the Red Army on Japanese forces in China, which they eventually did, at least in part. So what a handful of Truman's advisors said was, if you just tell the Japanese that the Soviets have already committed to get into the war, they're going to come running to the peace table, because they know they're already basically defeated by us now. If the Russians get involved as well, we're for sure done, and they want no part of that. Oddly enough, the Russians and the Japanese had been on opposite sides, since they both got involved in the war, but they'd never actually fought each other, even though they had interests quite close to each other as well. But it's only at this point that the Russians are threatening the Soviet Red Army eventually does get involved. The other piece of advice or suggestion given to Truman by advisors, some on the military and the political side, was the status of the Japanese emperor. The Japanese emperor had always been seen as a sacred figure, a godlike figure, and there was great concern among the Japanese public as well as leadership that the emperor was going to be treated roughly after the war. There was talk, for instance, in the West about trying him as a war criminal. Hirohito is his name, and he possibly might go to prison and get executed. And Japanese leaders were concerned that this could cause, social unrest, militancy, big time, if their emperor is treated in that fashion. But the advisors, on this side, told Truman, if you just give the Japanese reassurance that we're not going to harm their emperor, we're not going to do that after the war, they'll also come running to the peace table. That's one of the main, sticking points at this point. One of the only ones. So if you tell them the Russians are coming in, and/or give them reassurance about the emperor, they're going to surrender. We won't have to invade them. We can stop bombing them, and we certainly don't have to use atomic bombs on them. Well, Truman didn't take the advice, so he didn't try. And we can't know for sure, even if he had listened to his advisors and done one or both of those things, that it would have worked. But it's possible that it would have worked, but we're never going to know. So the conventional wisdom is as follows, and I think the minority of historians that are critical of the decision, they have a point. They make pretty good arguments, but in the end, I still think it's not clear enough. I still think the conventional wisdom holds, and that is this, that the United States was facing the possibility of having to invade the mainland of Japan. By the time they got to Okinawa and Iwo Jima and took those islands, they were already bombing Japanese cities from the air, long range, high altitude bombing. day after day after day. Huge bombing raids on Tokyo, one that caused a firestorm. The city was so hot, it caused sort of a spontaneous fire after the bombings were already over. Tens of thousands killed on one evening. So these massive bombing raids with conventional weapons and bombs. These aren't atomic bombs. These are just hundreds of bombers dropping thousands of bombs night after night. So that was already being done. But the Japanese, as we know, were still not surrendering. So there was already some amount of thinking, a little bit of planning, and there would have been more for sure, about how we're going to take the Japanese home islands. Right after all this, warfare, all this difficult slog across the Pacific, it still remained the largest task of all. Still remained, undone, and that was attacking the Japanese main islands, going all the way to Tokyo. And it was estimated, though it wasn't ever formally estimated through a study, but off the top of leaders' heads, that 500,000 to 1,000,000 Americans may be casualties if it comes to that, and probably as many or more Japanese soldiers and citizens, because we know what the skewed numbers have looked like of casualties on all the islands we've talked about before. The Japanese fighting to the bitter end, and then losing more soldiers than the Americans. So if the critics are wrong, then the only two options appear to be: we can either drop 2 atomic bombs, or one was a possibility too, and destroy a city or two, admittedly killing tens of thousands, over 100,000 as it turned out in the end, Japanese citizens, men, women, children, old people alike, or we can land troops on the Japanese home islands, and it will have to be a massive invasion that might kill or wound 500,000 to 1,000,000 Americans, and at least as many or more Japanese, which will probably be men, women, and children as well, latter being caught in the crossfire. Now, it's a terrible thing to contemplate, to be sure, but it's a lesser of two evils situation. And I end up saying this until I'm blue in the face. I probably already have a number of times in this class. But life and the world doesn't always deliver to us options of good and bad. Sometimes, sadly, it is a lesser of two evils world, and it gives us the options of bad and worse. Well, I want the good option. Sorry, there isn't one. There's bad and worse. And this may have been one of those moments, and one of the biggest such moments in world history. The bad option, was dropping 2 atomic bombs on 2 cities and incinerating, both cities and everybody in them, or almost everybody in them. The worst news, the worst possibility, was an invasion of the home islands, because there'd be more people killed. Possibly a couple million casualties, or killed and wounded, on both islands. That's far more than the tens of thousands that ended up being killed in the atomic bombings. So it's awful to have to say, but if those were the only 2 possibilities, it's possible that they weren't, but if those are the only 2 possibilities, you have to choose one or the other. Both options are bad. You pick the one that's less bad. And this is what Truman did by allowing the bombing to go through without a major meeting to kind of stop it. So on August 6th and August 9th, the 2 atomic bombs developed at Los Alamos in New Mexico. One of them had been tested, a plutonium bomb, one a uranium bomb. So 2 different types of nuclear devices tested over these urban centers, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you can see the damage done. I think that's to Hiroshima on the upper right. The Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, August 6th, is in the bottom right. And this changed the world forever. Right? We can't put the genie back in the box. At least we haven't been able to so far. The world still faces the possibility of nuclear Armageddon, nuclear Holocaust. And it all started right here. Also, and I don't like to beat up on Americans more than they deserve to be, and we deserve to be in some ways. But it is true. We often sort of can't understand why other people in other parts of the world don't like us, or are suspicious of us, are scared of us. Well, maybe it's at least in part because we're the only country in world history that's ever used atomic weapons on another people and another country, ever. I mean, we were the only ones who had them at that point, but now there are several nuclear powers, and we're still the only country to have used nuclear weapons. I hope it stays that way, by the way, and nobody else does use them. The world would be a better place if nobody ever uses them again, of course. Japanese officials you see in a famous picture aboard the USS Missouri signing the official and final surrender papers, which forced the Japanese into, and had already stated this earlier in the war, Roosevelt stating it in, I think, 1943, unconditional surrender terms. Roosevelt sort of threw that out there, and once it went public, couldn't have gone back on it, I think, even if he wanted to, and some of his advisors were surprised that he'd done so because it gave the U.S. less flexibility. But unconditional surrender meant we're not going to sit down when the war is over and haggle with you. We're not going to, compromise with you. We're not going to make a deal with you. You're going to surrender, and we're going to issue the terms of surrender, and there's going to be no negotiation at all. So the unconditional surrender terms are harsh ones. Were harsh ones, but the Japanese here finally realized they had no realistic option but to do so. Though it's not entirely clear even now. Last thing we'll say on this: this is disputed by scholars as well, that it was the atomic bombs that caused the Japanese to come to the table in the first place. What else could it have been? Well, the promised or threatened, depending on how you look at it, help of Stalin's Soviet Red Army was put underway just before the bombs were dropped. And from the timing of Japanese cabinet meetings, we know when they met and who met, we know then that it appears from the timing that they were more worried about and more frightened of the Soviet invasion than they were the atomic bombs. Not that they weren't necessarily frightened of both, but there is some, I've read quite a bit about this, there is some, I think, reason to think that it's possible that the main reason that Japan surrendered was the Soviet Union, the Soviet Red Army.